Buckle up. This one is going to be next level, in-depth understanding of the power structure on this planet. A few people were asking last year having these kind of topics, so here they are. And our next presenter is James Bartley, and he'll be discussing this at a deeper, more profound level. And humans in our ignorance, we think we're the top of the food chain on this planet. Why would we think that? Because we can't see anybody else that's more advanced than us, has better technology than us, and has some kind of better integration into more covert systems of control and manipulation. Or perhaps that's all part of the deal, that's exactly what it is, a more superior ability to remain in charge of this planet, but covertly. And this is what James will be addressing. James is a contactee with ET and reptilian experiences. He's been mentored by highly regarded people in the field. He's investigated UFOs and alien abductions for over 30 years, and he has his own podcast. James is heavily invested in the topics of ufology, ETs, all these topics that he'll be discussing today, and he is a veteran, as I said, with over 30 years of experience, and he's really committed to the topic. He's very passionate about the topic. Has international recognition around the planet for the research and what he's offering, and he's going to take you through his presentation today, which is going to be quite an eye-opener for some of you, including me. So please make very welcome James Bartley.
Thank you, Michael. Can everybody hear me okay? Yes. What a powerful, moving talk by the gal that preceded me, Dr. Arena. That was wonderful. Some of the things she touched on relate directly to what I'm going to be talking about. My name is James Bartley, as Anthony said, and thank you, Anthony, for putting together a fine conference here. There's a lot of things you can do in a wonderful place like Surfer's Paradise, but the fact that you take time out of your busy lives to come to a place like this speaks volumes about who you are and what you want out of life, understanding, awareness, etc., etc. So applause to yourselves. Now, I've been in this field for over 30 years, and I've worked with some of the giants in the field. Barbara Bartholic was my mentor. She knew a lot about the reptilian abduction experiences. Her most famous and well-known protege was Dr. Carla Turner, who was also a friend of mine. I've worked with Evelyn Lorgan. Some of you know Eve Lorgan's work. I've worked a lot in the high desert of Southern California, where there's a lot of reptilian activity, underground base activity, so on and so forth. And I'll touch on all those issues as we go along. I'm going to be talking about the reptilians, and before I embark on that, I just want to assure everybody that fear and faith and an understanding of oneself, they cannot really coexist. Dr. Arena just talked about how our very thoughts and feelings and emotions, if we let them run away in the form of OCD thought loops, so on and so forth, negative, despairing thoughts, it can have a malign influence on us as people. It can literally make us sick. So I'm not here to spread fear about this subject. I'm here to raise awareness, understanding about the reptilians and their minions, their cosmic vassals that work for the reptilians. There are good reptilians and there are good ETs, but my focus in this presentation is to talk about the reptilians that are not so good, that have a malign influence on humanity. Reptilians are essentially, there's three types of them: subterranean, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. Back in the dawn of our recorded history, there were only generally two forms of worship: heliocentricity, i.e. sun worship, and serpent worship, i.e. worship of lizard-like, serpent-like beings. Now, we know in the distant past, a lot of these gods that were worshipped by our ancestors were not really gods as we understand the term. Many of them were extraterrestrials. Some were reptilians, but not all of them. The gods that manifested to humans in past times sometimes came from a variety of ET civilizations and underground subterranean civilizations, and I'll get to that. So reptilians could basically be divided into three categories: subterranean, extraterrestrial, interdimensional. There are known capabilities of reptilians and Dracos, and for our purposes here, the Dracos or the Dracs are the winged gargoyle species. And many believe the Dracos to be kind of at the top of the heap as far as the caste system of the reptilians are concerned. It's the reptilians, quite frankly, who bequeath to us this concept of caste systems, that there is this elite bloodline of priesthoods, if you will, that some people are inherently more superior to others, and the majority are inferior to the hierarchy. We very much got that whole mindset and concept from these beings, because it's a key component of the control system. The known capabilities of reptilians and Dracos: they can alter their density and utilize invisibility. They are masters of frequency and resonance. Dr. Arena was just talking about frequency and resonance. They can create portal entries in your home and manifest just about anywhere at any time, including inside moving vehicles. A friend of mine, Diane Johnson, in the high desert of Southern California, was driving along in her car. Next thing you know, she smelled kind of a sulfurous kind of odor, and she looked into the rearview mirror, and there was a smaller reptilian that had manifested in her vehicle in the back seat. How she managed to stay on the road, I don't know. Some reptilian groups are quite technologically advanced and can manipulate time and space. Emotional and energetic harvesting. We are resonators of feelings, emotions, energy, and motion. We emit frequencies of energy fields, and our emotions can be manipulated. It behooves parasitical beings to keep us in a lower frequency vibratory bandwidth. For so long, we've been handicapped by the fact that because of the dogma of science and how science has become a religion, seeing is believing, so we're told. But we know that the light spectrum, the visible light spectrum, is such a tiny fraction of reality around us. This gives these beings that have the ability to alter their energetic density and their frequency the ability to malignly, subtly, covertly influence us, individually or en masse as a society. Dr. Arena also talked about OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, and I talk a lot about obsessive compulsive thought disorders, OCD thought loops. I've had Jerry Marzinski on my show, who spent over 30 years in the psychological field working in the largest, at the time, sanitarium, essentially insane asylum, in the state of Georgia. And then after that, he worked in the prison system in Arizona, working with psychiatric patients. He and his colleague, Cheryl Sweeney, had found out to their satisfaction that a lot of the voices that their patients / inmates were hearing were not their own voices. These voices were intrusive thoughts being put into their heads. And as you know, folks, in the spirit world, thoughts are things. Thoughts become words, words become actions, actions become habitual behaviors, and behaviors can affect our destiny. So what Sherry Sweeney and Jerry Marzinski found out, and you can listen to their interviews on my podcast, they found out that a lot of these people that had been diagnosed as paranoid schizophrenics were in fact being malignly influenced by these unseen entities. Now, however, not all of these entities are invisible to everybody. Some of you in this room can see auric fields. I can. I was looking at Dr. Arena's and it was like out to here, right? Some of you probably noticed the same thing. Some people have bigger auric fields than others. But one has to have that etheric third eye vision in order to see that. And because of the blockages of our pineal gland, the toxic food people ingest, they've lost that ability to be able to sense their environment. When an animal in the field is subject to predation, and they feel there's a predator in the area, they don't have a thinking process when it comes to their safety. Oh, that scent I detected. Oh, that sound that I heard. Am I being stalked right now? No. The moment they feel anything change in their environment, energetically, whatever, they bolt, because they're aware of the multiple threat environment in which they reside. Unfortunately, humans don't. They've lost that ability by and large, but I think many people are starting to regain that. Now, I belabor this point because it's important to what I'm going to be talking about. How thoughts become things, and obsessive compulsive thought disorders can make people mentally ill and have physical illnesses. What Jerry Marzinski and Sherry Sweeney and others have found out is these entities that are invisible to most people are inserting these thoughts into people. And Jerry points out, you will notice, these obsessive compulsive thoughts are never of a positive variety. It's never, you're going to get that job, you're going to get a pay raise, you're going to get a second date. It's nothing like that. It's always despair, hopelessness, lack of self-worth, etc., etc. And one has to wonder, where are these thoughts coming from? Important point. These entities, reptilians in particular, strive to create emotional anguish and misery within people. Again, we are resonators of frequencies. And these entities that are negative parasitical entities feed off of our emotions. They don't want all of us to be in a constant state of serenity, of joy, of contentment. That doesn't feed them. They need us to be in a constant state of turmoil, confusion, mistrust, suspicion. That feeds them. It's louche. It's something energetic which is very real in the spirit world. The drama of the love obsession, i.e. the alien love bite, that is a whole nother subject. And my colleague and I, Eve Lorgan, talked about this for many years, that some of these alien beings have the ability, and I don't want to talk about it here because it'll take too long, they have the ability to create these obsessive love bonds between two people. And these two people have oftentimes been paired and bonded from early childhood to have experiences together. Periodically, over a certain period of time, they're brought together first as children, energetically and physically, sometimes on board the craft. And then years later, these two people run into each other, sometimes at a UFO conference, or online nowadays because of social media. And then they meet, and then this instant chemical reaction takes place. They begin to have all this psychic bonding, dreams with each other. All this stuff starts going on. And what happens is, what my mentor, Barbara Bartley, called the drama of the love obsession ensues. And again, it's an energetic feed to these beings. When one is truly in love with another person, one should never have this love drug feeling. Right off the bat, that tells you that there's something wrong, because that means that we're out of balance. So that's a key point to make. And if you want to talk more about any of these subjects I raise, because I have to kind of move through this stuff, because I got a lot of information to share. Usually, I give a lecture about 4.5 hours plus when I talk about this stuff. Minimum 4.5 hours. The capabilities of reptilians. They have asserted control over other races of ETs and have created genetic crossbreeds who do their bidding. I've been talking to David Eckhart lately, and on my podcast, David Eckhart is the next interview that's queued up. David Eckhart has had a lot of reptilian in particular experiences. He's been in the underground reptilian bases, and he's seen these other slave races essentially working for the reptilians. Sometimes there are subservient reptilian races that are doing the bidding of a more powerful reptilian race, again, that caste system. And other times there are genetic crossbreed hybrids of various different races, as well as some factions of the ubiquitous grays many people describe. Many of them work for the reptilians. We reside in essentially a reptilian sphere of influence. They seem to have alliances with certain factions of the Nordics and do interact with certain factions of Palladians, as unpleasant as they may sound to some. They can mimic voices and affect electronics. One of my friends, Lorena Smith, you can also find her interview on my show. She lived in the high desert of Southern California, and she had active portals in her house where portals would open up and entities, many times reptilians, would step out into her house. There was an active portal entry in the wardrobe in the children's bedroom. And if you look throughout history, you read the lore, folklore of all these different cultures around the world, they talk about what Americans call closets, but we know as wardrobes. Lion the witch in a wardrobe, a portal into another reality, etc., etc. Well, these reptilians had created a portal entry in the wardrobe of the children's room and would come out. But that wasn't the only portal entry in the house. It just happened to be where most of the activity took place, to the point where Lorena no longer allowed her children to sleep in that bedroom. So me and my colleagues came up with the bright idea of sleeping in that bedroom. So me and my buddy Craig, he's also, sorry I keep plugging my show, but he's also one of the people I interviewed on my show. Me and Craig would flip a coin, okay? Heads, you win, tails, you lose. If you get heads, you sleep on the bed. You get tails, you sleep on the floor in a sleeping bag. So one night I got tails and I was sleeping on the floor. And what happened was, suddenly this paralysis came over me. I couldn't move, and then I managed to pry my eyes open, and there was this large, lack of a better term, reptilian looming over me. And I'm laying there, I'm trying to speak, Craig, there's one in the room. I couldn't even get that out. Paralysis set in, couldn't even open my mouth. And it loomed over me for a while, and just awful negative presence, and eventually I just blacked out. And that's an example of how they can enter the house through a portal entry. But I digress. I was going to talk about mimic voices and affect electronics, because during those reptilian stakeouts, when Craig and I and others of our team would spend in Lorena's house, which was a hot zone of activity, we learned that they can mimic voices. Now, Lorena was telling me there were times when she would hear her children's voices the other side of the house, but she knew it couldn't be them because she dropped them off at school. So she realized that something is going on here. Something is mimicking my children's voices to the point where I have to go and investigate. And in one of these stakeouts that we did, Craig and I, you talk about nervous laughter and joking and all this other stuff. There was only room in that children's bedroom for the two of us, and we had a few other people out in the living room sleeping out there. And I guess we were kind of nervous and, to be truthful, somewhat scared because of all the activity had amped up in that house. This is near Victorville, California, the high desert of Southern California, a real hot zone for reptilian, alien, and deep black military activity. The whole area is festooned with underground bases, underground tunnel systems. And Craig and I were really nervous, making all these jokes and whatnot. And eventually we both fell asleep. And what happened was, the next morning we woke up. Nothing happened that night. And then our friends waiting that were in the living room told us, wow, you guys had a real party last night. All you did was just talk and laugh and joke all night. No, we didn't. We only did that for about 5 or 10 minutes because we were nervous about being in there, and we fell asleep. So what had happened was these reptilians mimicked our voices, our mannerisms, and everything else to the point where it made the people in the living room think that we were awake all that time. You see? They can assume the guise of other ETs such as Nordics, tall grays, and can assume the guise of human military personnel. Now, we've heard all this talk about shape-shifting and whatnot, and I really do believe that certain beings have this ability to do that. They have an understanding of genetics, an understanding of a molecular structure, cellular structure, et cetera, that just defies logic when we try to cram the square peg of this modern dogma of science and what passes for it into what really goes on. It's like cramming a square peg into a round hole. These beings, some of them really can shapeshift and assume the guise of other beings. And what they do sometimes, and this could take a long time, I'm going to just give a short example, is they can manifest themselves in the astral dreamscape. When we are dreaming, they can come into our dreamscape and they can assume the guise of our loved ones, our friends, a past lover, whatever the case may be, in order to try to create a stage-managed dream and manipulate things to their advantage, oftentimes at our expense. That's a whole other story. And again, if any of you want to talk or ask about these things in depth, I'll be sitting out there. They can assume an amorphous black shape. One time, I had this dream. It was a case where these entities, because we're in our sleep state, these entities that are of the parasitical negative variety, they hold the strategic tactical high ground, if you will. There we are sleeping. We spend most of our life sleeping. Because their ability to alter their density and frequency, they can be as solid as this object, this lectern in front of me, in one moment, and be porous, translucent, invisible in the next. And what some of these beings do sometimes is they alter their frequency and their density to the point where they can merge with us while we're sleeping. They enter into our physical being, and what they can do is they can then create what I call a stage-managed dream. And they can do a number of things in there. They can create this aura of fear, of trepidation. They can eroticize the dream on the one hand, and way over in the other end of the spectrum, they can really make it frightening and whatnot. And then again, it's to get this energetic feed, and also to instill compulsive behaviors, especially of a sexual variety or impulse manipulation, so on and so forth. Well, anyway, I'd woken up from this strange dream, and then I saw above me this amorphous black shape that was hovering above me. At that moment, I was tingling from head to toe, and I could feel something literally leaving my body. It was an icky, tingly feeling that I felt all over, and I knew immediately what was going on was one of these entities had entered into me during my sleep state, and now, because I woke up, because of the weird, bizarre nature of the dream, this entity began backing out. But before it completely left my room, I saw above me this dark, kind of amorphous black cloud, for lack of a better shape. And then I just basically, one way to get rid of these beings, folks, is you can, and I know that with wordplay, a lot of people say, well, you got to be careful about what you say, and you know, you study the etymology of words because you may actually be drawing things to you. And in truth, from a ceremonial black magic sense, a lot of that does happen. But whether you choose the word bless you or some other kind of term that you're familiar with or you're comfortable with, one of the things that I've learned to do is when I find myself in a state of paralysis and I feel really strongly a negative presence in the bedroom, I just smile within, even if I can't open my mouth, even if I can't say anything because of the paralysis. I just exude from my heart center this rose quartz red color throughout the room, just imbued with love, imbued with serenity. And I literally bless this being. I say, bless you, bless you, bless you. And I really mean it. And I have an inward smile. And as the paralysis begins to break and I'm able to move my mouth, and I start verbally saying out loud, and I'm still visually pushing out this rose-colored quartz aura throughout the room, just encompassing the whole house. And I'm saying, bless you, bless you, bless you. And the entity backs off, and it backs off. Now I can get up off the bed. Now I turn the light on, I'm walking around, I'm saying, bless you, bless you. And I really mean it. I want this entity to get off the treadmill and say, you know what, I've been parasitically feeding off these humans for eons in our linear time sense. I think it's time to get off the bus. Maybe I can do something else, right? I want that for that being. And so I turn the lights on, I'm walking around blessing, 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 and eventually it just goes away, and I stay up for a while so it doesn't just come right back when I go to sleep, you know. Reptilians and Dracos sexually manipulate humans is a whole nother topic. I don't have a time to delve into it, and you know, truth to tell, some of the aspects of this particular category can be very dark, can be very frightening. And again, folks, there's nothing wrong with the darkness. There's nothing wrong with bringing these issues up. I'm not trying to instill fear. You light a match in a darkened room, the darkness flees. All nighttime is darkness of the day. There's nothing to be fearful about. I'm just bringing awareness to certain key issues that need to be raised. We are sexual beings. The reptilians and Dracos exploit this fact. We are resonators, and they strive to keep us locked into the lower chakras. And this is where at least some of these sexual manipulated disorders come from. Whether it's, you know, compulsive self-gratification, whether it's people who can't avoid getting involved with negative, toxic, manipulative, controlling people. And I say all this without one iota of judgment or intolerance. These people sometimes act out in this fashion through an imposed ignorance, through manipulation. There's nothing to be shamed or feel guilty about any of this stuff. We are sexual beings, and these beings manipulate us sexually. They instill addictive, compulsive, and self-destructive behaviors, and the whole drug issue is a whole other aspect to this, which I can talk about later. Okay, I already did that. Control is exerted through hybrids, the reptilian concept of human ownership. And again, this delves into dark issues, but as a necessary prerequisite for me to understand how reptilians operate on the surface, how they work through hybrids, I had to study the work of the FBI profilers and the other profilers, get into the minds of the serial killers, the predators, the child molesters, et cetera, as distasteful and at times troubling and painful that was. I had to understand from a reptilian standpoint how they think, how they operate. Some of these reptilian races literally think they own us. We've heard many times from serial killers, we've heard many times from males. I'm not just picking on males, but people that are habitually abusive, psychologically and physically abusive, where they talk about how they own somebody. Oh no, that marriage certificate, that's proof of ownership. She belongs to me. You hear these memes coming out from people that have this concept of ownership, of collecting people. And that is, like I said, an inherently non-human mindset, because from a truly human, all-pervasive standpoint, we are all equal. We can all learn and we can all benefit from mutually beneficial relationships. One does not have to be in control of others. One does not have to manipulate others in order to derive some kind of benefit, mutual benefit from their acquaintance. Well, these reptilians, the negative ones I'm talking about, they've imbued this concept of human ownership into their hybrids. It goes back to the Bible, the book of Genesis, the Nephilim interbreeding with human females, which you can find in the lore of all these cultures throughout the world. There's nothing even unusual about this. Just as serpent worship has always been there if you study the lore. The concept of this blending of the gods and humans is rife throughout history. John Edwards, former U.S. politician, ran for the presidency one time. Former member of the Bilderberg Group. And the only reason I put him up there is to show that his pupils in this instance are vertical, right? You will find sometimes in an unguarded moment these reptilian hybrids, whether they're angry or if they're sexually aroused or they're very tired, whatever the case may be, what happens is they let their guard down and momentarily you can see that their pupils go vertical. And sometimes when they're really angry or irked at somebody, this can happen. And sometimes the morphing is even more extreme than that. Sometimes their whole face can change and whatnot. Now, I only use this picture as an example of what I'm talking about. I don't want to pick on this gal. She could be the salt of the earth, warm-hearted, loving person. All I'm pointing out is that at times, sometimes people's pupils can become quite vertical in appearance, right? So I'm not picking on her. As far as I know, she's not a politician. She's not a member of the Bilderberg Group. Creation of hybrids via genetic manipulation. Reptilian and Draco-human hybrids have a genetic, energetic, and spiritual predisposition to being taken up as a host. A host is someone who is a genetic hybrid. And because these entities, many of them, have the interdimensional capability, I must point out that for many years in the UFO field, they try to create these artificial fault lines between what's extraterrestrial and what's interdimensional. I would argue that some of these beings have both capabilities. It's not mutually exclusive. Some beings literally come from other worlds in our cosmos, from other star systems, but have an interdimensional capability precisely because they can alter their density. Precisely because they can become a spirit being, if you will, at the drop of a hat. Well, what happens is some of these beings exist in a non-corporeal state, outside of what we call linear time. And through this reptilian genetic program, on the one hand, it could be just simple mixing and matching and pairing up families, couples, and working through bloodlines down through the ages. David Icke talks about this, but many others have talked about this as well as advanced genetical tweaking. They can ensure that the offspring born in these families are genetically and indeed spiritually predisposed to being taken up as a host. And also, those ones they're grooming for positions of influence and power in front of the TV camera and behind the scenes, they can ensure through involvement in all these ceremonies, rituals, and what have you, that these people get opened up even more and these entities can comfortably take them up as a host. And after a while, the consciousness of these people, you can really not even consider them quite human anymore. They think, they act, they operate, they work in cliques and networks that are inimical to the well-being of the human race and the planet, I might add, because we have the symbiotic relationship with our planet. And none of us here in this room would ever conceive of running a corporation to the point where it's polluting the rivers and polluting the waters and polluting the atmosphere and the soil. That is just so over the top right? But that's the normal way of business of these entities who control the corporations, who control all of that. These entities are familiars. I call them that because they track family trees. Now, sometimes what happens is these entities can skip a generation, or particularly relatively normal, but they have one or more siblings, in our example, that are generally malignly influenced by these entities. And the reptilians by no means are the only ones. But they can be born into a family of narcissists and have to suffer all that abuse and manipulation as a result. And we know that that kind of psychological abuse can have a knock-on effect that can last for a long time. I feel that some of us come here from a higher dimension, a higher spiritual plane, to make a difference. And it's almost as if I didn't know any better, while we're in the bardo state, in between lives, we're given an option, okay? And they're not all perfect, ideal options. You can be born into this family, pluses and minuses. You can be born into this family, pluses and minuses. And some people, being the true spiritual warriors they are, they have chosen at some level to be born into some really dysfunctional, toxic, narcissistic families. And I hold those people in high esteem because many of them have had to suffer from all this psychological abuse, and they've worked very hard to heal themselves, to reintegrate, to pull in those disparate parts of themselves that have been fragmented through all this manipulation and abuse. And it happens at multidimensional levels. I talked about astral dreamscape manipulation briefly, and all these other forms of manipulation. So these hybrid hosts not only operate at the higher strata, if you will, of society, in high finance, in industry, in the media, in politics, in the military, but they're all over. They're everywhere. This accounts for why some people, Dr. Arena was talking about, negative people at work or in other family social settings. And these people literally are everywhere. That's why it's important for us to be able to recognize frequencies and energy. That's absolutely key. Like, I can tell when there's a negative entity in the room, even if it's invisible. I can also tell if somebody, one or more people in the room, are a host for one of these negative parasitic entities. We've all been around people who are energy vampires, who are energy drains. You're around them for a very short period of time, and your knees are wobbly, you can't catch your breath. That's an example of what I'm talking about. It's an energetic feed that's going on at our expense. Reptilian and Draco hybrids who are perpetrators are lacking in frontal lobe capacity. This is why they lack empathy and are sadistically cruel. If you study the work of the profilers, you will find, and they've actually done CT scans of some of these serial killers. And they found that the frontal lobe is our impulse control net. It prevents us from acting out in an impulsive manner. What these entities do is, because of this genetic hybridization program that's been going on for thousands of years, they create these reptilian human hybrids, Draco human hybrids, that are completely lacking in frontal lobe capacity. And so because these entities have the ability to insert not only thoughts into people's heads, but also insert mental imagery into their heads, oftentimes a very sadistic, very violent, sexually violent nature. You hear these serial killers talk all the time about, oh, I just can't stop all these violent thoughts coming in my head, and I just can't stop all this violent imagery. That's what I'm talking about. And they've actually done studies on serial murderers, and they found that they are absolutely lacking, many of them, in fact all of them, in frontal lobe capacity. The frontal lobe is what keeps us from acting out in an impulsive fashion. When someone cuts us off on the road, or someone butts in front of us at the checkout stand, we don't just lose it and freak out. I mean, inwardly, we may have a movie playing in our mind about how we'd like the scene to evolve, but we have that impulse control, okay? That impulse control has been literally bred out of them, which accounts in many ways for why they are able to do all these things with no conscience, with no compassion. Oh, how can they sleep at night? Of course they can sleep at night. They don't have a frontal lobe capacity, right? The creation of the reptilian Draco-human hybrid bloodlines is the fundamental building block of the reptilian overlordship. They had to have these middle managers, what I call plantation managers, in order to affect the kind of changes they needed on the surface in order to keep this emotional, energetic harvest, all these wars and everything else going. R complex of the brain. Reptilian brain sits on the limbic system. R complex equals the lizard brain. The oldest part of the brain literally is called the R complex for reptilian. Now I got to start moving on because, again, I speak usually for hours on the subject. Opening with a figure wearing a hat. This wound up in my friend's mobile phone in the photo album section. He doesn't know how it got there, but he was like flipping through his pictures one day, and we've all heard stories, those of us who study the paranormal, about shadow beings, about beings with hats. You can go online. It's a whole genre of research about hat beings wearing hats, and this appears to be one of them. It seems to be a portal opening up, and then this being, who I think is a hat, manifesting, coming through it. The aforementioned Craig Bowers, a good buddy of mine, he woke up one night and he looked up, and above his headboard he saw this. This portal opening had opened up, and it was dark, it was a cavern system. He can see in the distance lights, which he construed to be some kind of a city or some kind of habitat, if you will. And then these three reptilians were looking down at him through this portal entry. Remember, he's laying on his back, he's looking up above his headboard, this is what he sees. For whatever reason, he felt that the being in the middle was a reptilian female. Very interesting. And Craig is one of those, hybrid type guys, except he's a good one, right? He's a spiritual warrior, he believes in freedom and all that stuff. The aforementioned Lorena, these two tall reptilian grays manifested in her bedroom one night, but she can see from her angle laying there, and that's actually, Craig drew this, and he's a good artist, and that's a very good depiction of what Lorena looks like. She could see from her angle laying on the bed that behind the eye patch, the black eye patches, was the reptilian vertical pupil. So she knew that these were either reptilian gray hybrids or they were reptilians in the guise of tall grays, and that happens too. Now these are what we call the baby Godzillas. Lorena was going through this mental tug of war. Oh, this is crazy. I'm just a housewife in Apple Valley, California. This can't be happening. The military is taking me to the underground base, interrogating me about reptilians. Just want to be left alone. And she convinced herself that it was all a dream, that she was going crazy, right? So one mid-late morning, after she got her kids off to work, these two smaller reptilians had shown up. And I've got a story about them too, because for lack of a better term, I call them immature because they're not fully grown yet. Anyway, these two showed up. You'll see one of them was holding this rod-shaped device in its hand. This is the kitchen. Lorena was at the sink doing dishes or something, and then these two beings manifested. She looked at them. The one with the rod pointed it at her. Next thing you know, Lorena levitated horizontally, about 5-6 feet off the ground, and the message she got from the entity that was holding the rod was distinct. It said, "Do you think this is a nightmare? Do you think you're dreaming this? Do you think you're going crazy?" So it was an object lesson. No, you're not going crazy. This is really happening, and this is what we can do to you. One of these beings, and I know it was one of the smaller ones. Me and Craig had once again spent a weekend in the children's room, and a happy ending. Those children, one of them was 2 years old. When I first met Lorena, now she's going to be married. She's got a kid. It's really cool that decades down the track, you can see good things coming out of all this. Anyway, Craig and I were sleeping in the room. I won the toss that night, so I was in the bed. He was on the floor. And what happened was, the sun was just starting to come up. I can start to see sun rays coming in through the curtains. And I heard a rustling. I heard a sound coming out of the wardrobe. So I sat up, thinking that a reptilian was coming out of the closet. Next thing you know, bop, bop, punch here and a punch there, knocked me out. What happened, folks, is one of these smaller, immature reptilians had basically punched me out and knocked me out. I had sore cheeks, a sore face for weeks after that experience. On another occasion, Lorena was cleaning the house in preparation for me and Craig coming over for another weekend to sleep in. We slept in different parts of the house too, not just the children's bedroom. But she was cleaning the place up in preparation for our arrival. And as she was doing so, a little reptilian ran out of her bathroom. She stepped on the tail of one of these little guys, and she said it squealed like a pig. Okay? Okay, this is an interesting story. One of my friends, of course, there's this notion that, oh, only people that believe in UFOs and aliens are a bunch of whack jobs and they're crazy. The person who drew this is now a fully fledged adult. He was a teenager, preteen when he drew this for me. And his father was a good friend of mine. His father ran the avionics. He worked for Naval Depot, Naval Air Station North Island. I worked at Naval Air Station North Island in communications for U.S. Naval Air Forces. And he worked in the next building over in what we call NADEP, Naval Aviation Depot. His job was working on the avionics of the FA-18 Hornets and the Navy version of the AWACS planes, Airborne Early Warning Command and Control craft. His job was to fix all the avionics of those types of aircraft. Anyway, and he had experiences, his brother had experiences, and his son was having experiences. Well, his son had an encounter with this reptilian. He described it as only being about 4 foot tall. Not all of them are big and robust. Some of them are quite small. And he drew a quite elaborate sketch. I mean, you can see he had what looked like a utility belt. He had this kind of collar and a cape kind of thing going on. And he said that it had a slithery tongue. So I thought that was interesting. And again, just like in the case with Lorena's children, he's all grown up now. Sketch provided by Dave. Dave Telford is a MyLab from the Sydney area, I think memory serves. He's kind of moved around. He's had a lot of experiences with reptilians, a lot of experiences with deep black elements of the military, because he's what we call a MyLab, a military abductee, a person who has valid, real ET encounters, but also somehow, probably due to his bloodline, we've been talking about genetics, genetic profiles, etc. For whatever reason, deep black elements of the military have an interest in him. And Dave drew these sketches for me. Reptilian. This is from Matt R. Matt R. is a former law enforcement officer from the city of New Orleans, and he recalls being taken to an underground part of a large shopping mall. Now, truth be known, beneath a lot of shopping malls, not only in America but in Australia as well, there are large tunnel systems. How am I doing on time?
Just under 20 minutes.
Oh, cool. Okay. There's a lot of tunnel systems beneath these malls. And Matt recalls being taken prior to Hurricane Katrina with a number of other people, taken beneath one of these malls, and inside the mall, it's proper, above ground, and being trained by reptilians. And apparently, if memory serves, there were covert elements of the humans there, whether they were military or what, but the reptilians were doing the training. And I've heard this for many years now, where people describe being trained in a military sense by, for lack of a better term, reptilians. And also, some of these reptilians were shapeshifters. One moment they can appear to be a human military guy, the next they can appear to be a full-fledged reptilian being. Well, Matt R. is one of these people. Likewise, I've interviewed him on my show. Photos for Matt R. That pattern and that color is very common amongst alien abductees. There's oval-shaped marks, a lime green kind of mark like this. These wash off after about a day or two. I've had a number of marks on my body. Sometimes in the past, I'd wake up, there'd be a big, angry, like magenta red almost mark on my body, but there would be no discomfort, no pain whatsoever. Sometimes these marks can linger for a long time, and sometimes mysteriously they can just disappear. There's a good friend of mine, Carol. She's from Melbourne, and she's likewise had reptilian experiences, but she's also another MyLab. She's been utilized in deep black covert operations on and off the planet. She's been used in a military capacity by deep black elements of the military. And that is a bruise on her thigh. And here's another mark on her forearm. Some of these marks can come in patterns. Very common, we have puncture wounds in the crook of the elbow. I've had them in the crook of the elbow, I've had them in the upper bicep. Sometimes the marks and or puncture wounds can come in patterns, triangles, what have you. That's a close-up of a mark. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. I spoke about Dave Eckhart earlier. Lon Strickler, an outstanding researcher from America, from Pennsylvania, he also describes himself as a Fortean researcher. If you remember, because I'm a student of ufology and I'm a student of the paranormal, so way back when there was a guy named Charles Fort in America, and he spent all of his time obtaining newspaper clippings of unusual events. And over time he put out papers, put out books, and what he described later became known as Fortean phenomena, right? So Lon described himself as a Fortean researcher to harken back to, give homage in a way to Charles Fort from way back when. Well, Lon was kind enough to introduce me to David Eckhart. Kudos to Lon. There's so much selfishness and backfighting and territoriality in the UFO field. Oh no, David is my abductee. You can't talk to him. Again, it's that, human ownership thing. I own you, I collect you. You can't talk to my abductees. But see, Lon operates at a higher spiritual level, so those things don't apply. Sure, James, I'll introduce you to him. So I sent David Eckhart links of some of my lectures, some of my work, and whatnot, and then he realized, yeah, I'm really into this reptilian research. And so we began corresponding. He's queued up. He's going to be the next interview on my podcast coming out early next week. David has had lots of encounters with the reptilians. They've been in his house, they've messed with his wife, they've messed with him, they've taken him to their underground lairs. He's seen the underground tunnels, cave systems. He's seen their technology. He's seen what they do down there. And again, some of this stuff is pretty grim. I'm not going to go into details about it, but it harkens back to what my mentor, Barbara Bartholick, and Dr. Carla Turner talked about decades ago, what they referred to as the processing plants underground. I'm not even going to elaborate on what they mean by that, but David has seen that. David Eckhart has. David has seen the genetic manipulation and the genetic programs going on underground with the reptilians. Somehow or other, I haven't asked him to elaborate on how he does it, but he's managed to capture images of these reptilians and other entities when they're entering into his house. When a portal stargate kind of thing manifests in his house, he's figured out a way to take a picture of it. And again, a lot of these entities are all around all the time anyway. And maybe it's a good thing. Maybe it's a blessing that we can't see all this stuff going on all around us. I mean, if someone said, well, James, you want to have the ability, etheric third eye vision to see everything that's going on all around you, I'm not too sure I'm ready for that at this stage. You know what I mean? I'm perfectly satisfied with just being able to feel their presence. That there was an error in the equations. And to my mind, the equations he was talking about had to be Einstein's equations, but that's just my feeling. He said, Ben Rich said that we found an error in the equations, we made a correction, and now we travel the stars. And that's a profound statement coming from a guy who's responsible for developing these so-called next generation aircraft. I'm not just talking about rocket propelled craft and thrust propulsion. I'm talking about electrogravitics, gravitational, artificially generated gravitational fields, electromagnetism, flying saucer technology, essentially. So when one looks at these pictures, if they're looking at it through the filter of this dogma science, which we've been brainwashed with, these pictures are just going to seem to them like a hoax. They're not going to make any sense whatsoever. See, these beings, they didn't go to our schools. They didn't go to MIT, and they didn't learn science here on our planet. They learned it elsewhere. So they have an understanding of how to open portals, how to open stargates. And I'd like to add that anywhere that consciousness goes, matter can go also. All matter is a frequency or a vibration that resonates at a certain rate, a certain frequency. Many of you have had precognitive dreams. I've had many precognitive dreams. So what does that tell you? That what we've been taught about time, the linear nature of it, is all washed up. It doesn't make sense. If we can have a precognitive dream and then something we dreamed about months or years before happens, that tells you that we can traverse time, forwards and backwards. And deep black elements of the military have figured that out. That's a whole other subject. Looking through this Stargate, on one occasion, he saw what appeared to be a cavern system on the other side. So this is an example of a cavern system that he's looking through, which he's been taken to on a number of occasions. He and his wife, taken as unwilling guest, if you will. Here's another example of the energy field. It could be a portal opening up in his house. You can see the furnishings, you can see the paintings on the wall. And yet this energy bubble, I call it the bubble picture for lack of a better term, there it is. Again, he calls this picture the Stargate. And he is able to see and capture images of whatever is on the other side. So kudos to Dave Eckhart for taking these pictures. Kudos to him for enduring a lot of heartache, trauma, fear, trepidation. And kudos to Lon Strickler for introducing me to him. Thank you, Lon. That's Dave Eckhart right there. And in the time I got left, 5 minutes, I want to thank you for being an attentive audience. I want to thank you for allowing me to share this information to you. Again, a lot of it can be rather negative, but again, if we look at it from the standpoint of raising one's awareness and recognizing that we live in what is essentially a multiple threat environment, that we are not at the top of the food chain, that our rulers or our presumed rulers are merely hybrid variants of us humans. If we had their power, if we had their authority, if we had their financial backing, we wouldn't do the things that they do because we're not like them. And we should revel in that fact. We are multidimensional beings. We've been here many times before. And this was a tough calling. It was asking a lot of us to come here, incarnate at this time to make a difference, to stand in the gap. So I applaud each and every one of you for doing that. I really do. And I would also point out that a lot of your past lives and a lot of my past lives were gearing us up for this moment in time. That a lot of times we were not necessarily the good guys in our past lives, but we took on certain roles, took on certain incarnations for the learning, understanding of strategy, understanding of tactics, understanding how these despotic civilizations and barbaric civilizations operate. From the inside, it'll give us a better understanding. And I do believe that some of us have conducted what I call incarnational infiltrations. That we deliberately, some of us, chose to incarnate into the Draco culture, into the reptilian culture, more than once, to find out exactly how they operate. And we are the sum of all of our parts. Some of you have had existence as lion beings. Some of you had existence as Palladians and Arcturans. But here you are. Because if you're going to be anywhere in this cosmos, if this is where it's at, this is where it's happening, this is where you can make the difference right here. A lot of us could be up in a higher dimensional plane, 5th, 6th, 7th dimension, and the influence that we have would have to be, it's increasingly, I think, because of the flux and the turbulence going on in more than one plane of existence, in multiple planes of existence actually, I think it's getting easier for some of our extended ET star family to start making inroads, start having more of an impact working through us. Because in actual fact, many of you here are boots on the ground. You are the sum of all your parts. You are not just Palladians, you are Lyrans, you are Arcturans, you are a variety of other beings, spiritual warriors, every single one of you, and you're here to make a difference, and I want to thank you for that. So thank you, Anthony, for having me on as a speaker, and I want to thank you all, and I really hope that you enjoy the rest of your time here.